Okay, Part 5, Constitutional Convention Part 5. I believe this is going to do it. We're going to close the deal. Okay, uh, summer's nearly gone. They've pretty much finished this thing up. They've agreed on 23 agreements, which still, you could stack them all up. You still don't have a document. So they created the Committee on Style, chaired by Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. They handed the agreements to the committee. They handed them to Gouverneur Morris, and he brought back a very, very nicely turned out document, which, as I said before, was precise where it needed to be precise and vague where it needed to be vague. So they agreed on it, they approved it, and they adjourned on September 17th, 1787. I've got to back up here because there was a bit of a debate on how to go about getting it approved. Okay, if you're even going to pretend that you're amending the articles, then in a way you probably should put the thing before the public as a kind of amendment in toto of the articles. In that case, it would have to be approved by the legislatures of all 13 states, and everybody do. Rhode Island would kill it gleefully. They've had no part in it, and if they didn't, North Carolina would. It was not necessarily going to be popular, so you can't do that. Or they could send it back to Congress for Congress's approval. That didn't look that good either, and Madison was wary of that because that might leave the impression that the Congress had created the Constitution and that Congress would feel authorized to alter it or change it in some way along through the years. So here's what they decided. Each state, this is in the last article of the Constitution, each state would summon a ratifying convention. To ratify means to put something officially into effect. And the states would hold elections where the voters would elect delegates to this convention, which would have one purpose. Each state would have a convention for the purpose of either approving, ratifying, or rejecting the Constitution. Now, as soon as it has been accepted by any 9 of the 13 states, then it would go into effect for those 9 states. And those who had not yet ratified it could just decide whether to join the club or go it alone as independent countries. They remembered the mistake they made with the Articles, where one state held it up for 2 years. Not that it mattered that much. This time, you wouldn't have a situation where 1 or 2 sorehead states could put pressure on the majority. This way, the holdouts, the pressure would be on them to join. So that having been decided, they approved the document, and on September 17th, the 42 delegates who were still in town held a signing ceremony, and 3 of them withheld their signatures because they weren't satisfied with it. Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia, who had put the Virginia plan before the convention, withheld his signature because he didn't like the fact it did not have a Bill of Rights. There were 2 others, same thing. One of those, I think, might have been Governor Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. So only 39 of them signed it. And if you had traveled through time and asked each of those men if he picks up that pen, mark this thing up. You can make any changes in there you want to. Every one of them would have torn into it. Nobody was completely satisfied with it. It was a product of too many bitter battles, too many unpopular compromises. They just went along because they felt like they had to have it. It's figuratively speaking, there's black eyes and loose teeth and bruises. It's kind of like an ugly baby. What do you do with an ugly baby? Well, you look at it and you try to smile and you say, well, it's what we got. Walmart's not going to give us our money back on this one. So only then did they go public with it. Supposedly a woman stopped Ben Franklin on his way out the door and said, what have we got? What have you given us? He said, a republic, if you can keep it. And the jury is still out on that one. All right, so this generated an enormous amount of surprise because, see, the journalists would have loved to cover this, but they're not talking about it. Um, it immediately sparked the most profound political debate in the whole history of the United States. And those who favored it immediately claimed the name Federalists. I've been told this was kind of what you call a daylight theft because up until then, the Articles had been termed a federal system. So that left the opponents with a negative name. And in politics, voters are more likely to favor something that sounds positive than something that sounds negative. The opponents were the anti-federalists. Okay, and this was a deep split and a profound debate, and a lot of people probably just weren't sure about it yet. The main thing, there are two things that motivated anti-federalists. Should I ever ask? Hint, hint, hint. Two things. One, the new federal government would be too powerful. How powerful is that? If you thought it was going to be too powerful, that'll make you an anti-federalist. The other was it does not have a Bill of Rights. It does not have a specific list of rights that people would be guaranteed. Madison had argued against that and continued to argue against it for the time being. The states had bills of rights. Wouldn't that be enough? So you have Federalists versus anti-Federalists. Now, the small states were delighted. They got a much better deal than they'd expected, and they jump in the boat very quickly. Within a couple of months, and they go public with this in September. By the end of the year, you've already got 6 of the 9 states on board, or 5 states on board. 5 of the 9 you're going to need to put it into effect. Only one, Pennsylvania, only one large state favored it, maybe because it was written in their state. But Delaware was the first. Delaware remains today the second smallest state. Then Pennsylvania, and then a number of other small population states. Rhode Island refused to summon a convention. Then moving into 1788, the approval rate slows down to about 1 every other month. Particularly big battle in Massachusetts, which had this enormous convention with over 500 delegates, and the main thing that split them was lack of a Bill of Rights. And there were a lot of delegates. If you just had that on there, they'd go along with it. And the backers of the Constitution, the Federalists in the Massachusetts Convention, thought, okay, we're going to get this done. They agreed to ratify it with some amendments or with some proposals, some reservations, which called upon, the new government to amend the Constitution once it was in effect to add a Bill of Rights onto it. Okay, so in effect, they're promising to add one, and that was accepted at the Massachusetts Convention. Ratified the Constitution by a fairly narrow margin. Okay, on June 21st, New Hampshire became the 9th state. That puts it over the top. It is a done deal, at least on paper. 4 states are still out, 3 of them large. Virginia is heavily populated with anti-federalists. So is New York. They're big states. They're out. North Carolina, considered then a big state, had summoned a convention which unanimously rejected the thing and adjourned. Rhode Island has not summoned a convention. All right, Virginia ratified only 4 days after New Hampshire did. That's far too soon to have got the news. But the Virginia delegates, probably cussing under their breath, overruling the objections of Patrick Henry, ratified it. They probably thought they don't want to be the ones to put it over the top, but if it's going to happen, they're going to have to be part of it. If someone had told them that Virginians would occupy the presidency for 32 of the first 40 years, they might have moved a little quicker. Okay. 32 of the first 36, I think. Okay. In New York, something significant came out of the debate there. James Madison, along with a man who was his ally up to until later, Alexander Hamilton, along with the third man who would have written more of the essays, but something interrupted him. He only has a few. So James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John J.A.Y. contributed a series of nearly 60 essays explaining and defending the new Constitution. All three men were at the convention, and it's the best explanation we have of what was in their mind, what they're thinking about, how this thing is going to work, how, rights will be protected, all that sort of thing. Hamilton and Madison were both geniuses, but Hamilton, this is serious. He's carrying on a busy law practice, and he can just sit down and jot down essays, which were published in the New York newspapers, that are still consulted as authoritative. Now, they're still in print under either the title The Federalist or The Federalist Papers. They're still there, and hopefully there are still law schools where in courses of constitutional law you would learn those. I'm told there's some that have moved on beyond that, they think, on the grounds that the Constitution starts with the original document, but it's no longer that relevant. There's this big heaps and piles of Supreme Court decisions which have kind of become the Constitution. Okay, so Virginia ratified, New York ratified. That's 11. That's enough. In the fall of 1789, with only 11 states, fall of 88, with only 11 states in, the states elected their first congressional delegations. The legislatures mostly chose the electors. They met, and every single one of them cast one of their two votes for George Washington. Now, originally, if I didn't mention this, the electors each would cast votes for two different persons for president. The only limitation, one of them had to come from some other state. Whoever got the most votes would be the president. Whoever got the second most votes would be the vice president. That turned out to be dysfunctional. I bypassed this. I should have gone back and done this. Consider this part of something further up the line there. I'm nearly out of time. It's believed now, if nobody gets a majority in the electoral vote, House of Representatives voting by states chooses somebody out of the top 5 vote getters. We've never had 5 vote getters, electoral vote getters. Probably the idea was the House of Representatives, nobody after Washington's going to get a majority, the Electoral College, or not very often. The Electoral College is a nominating procedure handing Congress, or the House of Representatives, a slate of 5 to choose from. So, in early 1789, the first Congress convened in New York City, our first capital. George Washington, who had reluctantly considered to be the first president, made his way to New York City, and it became a sort of triumphal procession with ceremonies and banquets at every stop along the way. Finally got there and was sworn in on Wall Street in New York City on April 25th, 1789. That's months after the constitutionally set date in February. Okay. And the mighty engine of government began to run. And it runs today. Majority rule had not prevailed. If you'd put this before the voters of the states in an up or down referendum, I doubt they would have had much of a chance. But we do not maintain that the majority is always right. It's just what we use to decide what to do. It worked out. We have a very good government, or we have until we've been working on tearing it down for this whole time. But the government was running. Just weird bounces of the political football got this thing approved. So that is going to do it for Unit 2 of History 1301. You need to have watched all of these, plus read the supplements in preparation for Exam 1, which will be due next week, along with the Chapter 12 quiz.